All right, so last chapter when I was talking about the Byzantine Empire, I mentioned something called the East-West Schism. And so schism is a term, it usually means a division or a split. It's often kind of refers to kind of like, usually in kind of religious organizations, but that's not always the case here. So there's technically two great schisms. So the first one was the one they called the East-West Schism that we talked about in last chapter. That was in 1054 when we had a dispute on who was the rightful leadership of Christendom at the time in Europe. So you had those in Western Europe tended to look to the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope. And then those in much of Eastern Europe, particularly like in Russia, into the Balkans and Greece, and then what was kind of like of Asia Minor there, they tended to look to the Patriarch of Constantinople, and that's the kind of the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. All right. This schism that we're talking about here usually is referred to the Western Schism or the Papal controversy, if you will. And so its origins are technically kind of like 80 years before the official, kind of what they classify as the official Great Schism. All right. So last chapter I was talking, and I didn't mention this, but I was talking about in France, Philip IV, who was the King of France. He established the Estates General, all right, which, like what Edward I did in England with the Model Parliament, was a kind of a political body that was kind of cloaking kind of Philip's kind of rule in the sense of kind of consent of the people, particularly the kind of major classes. So he used that merging merchant class, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, to offset the kind of power and influence, particularly nobles who had traditionally kind of been kind of rebellious, and the clergy. All right, and on top of that, Philip is wanting the church to basically adhere to his kind of like legal code, what like Henry II did in England with common law. All right. One of the things that Philip is known for is basically trying to acquire as much wealth as possible. All right. He's the one who has the Knights Templar pushed to get them disbanded so he can confiscate their land and wealth. He kicks the Jews out of France for a brief period of time so he doesn't have to pay back loans and try to confiscate their wealth. All right. And so he tries to tax the church. So the church has none of it. They don't want any of it. And so they issue, at the time, the Pope was a guy named Boniface VIII. Boniface is one of the more stronger popes. Matter of fact, he used quite frequently his army to basically, there was one story in which he basically strong-armed the city over tithing in south of Rome there. He, matter of fact, sent the troops in there and they salted the fields, all right, so to prevent something from growing, the crop from growing and stuff. So Boniface is a very political pope. So he takes this attempt by Philip as a challenge. So he issues a bull, which are these kind of like church edict statements, which is known as the Bull of 1296, which basically states the church could not be taxed by the King of France. Church has their own legal code. They do not have to adhere to this. Essentially, Philip's like, that's great, but I'm going to try to continue to make this happen. All right. So what ends up happening a little bit later, then another Boniface issues another kind of edict called Unum Sanctum, which basically says there's two powers on earth. There's the temporal, the earthly powers, all right, and then there's the spiritual. The temporal, that's the realm of kings and emperors, all right, nobles. The spiritual, that's the realm of the papacy and the church, all right. And according to him, the spiritual always supersedes the temporal, meaning kings must obey popes. That's basically it. Philip, again, kind of disregards this. There's one in between the two that Philip actually publicly tore up in public, all right? So Philip is threatened with excommunication. This is somewhat similar. We had talked about like kind of the lay investiture controversy with Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV in the Holy Roman Empire. So what ends up happening, you don't need to write this out because it's for my pending Alzheimer's. Philip goes on the offensive. So he sends a small army to Italy with the idea of just simply kidnapping the Pope and taking him back to France for trial. Seems like a very kind of bold move there. All right. So the French soldiers do make their way. And they find out that he's not in Rome. He's in a neighboring town called Agni, in which he is held up in a palace, and he's captured. Stories is he's roughed up a little bit. Then he's saved by the people of Agni, but Boniface dies like a month later. Whether it's over his injuries or not is somewhat debatable. Philip doesn't care. Philip actually wants to put him on trial posthumously after he dies. All right. After Boniface, there's Benedict XI becomes Pope, and he's only Pope for 2 years. Then Philip decides that he's going to get involved in deciding who's the next Pope. So he persuades the College of Cardinals, who we talked about earlier in the chapter. They're the ones who kind of meet in a conclave and pick a Pope. And what that persuasion was is somewhat debatable, whether it's bribery or kind of strong-arming them. Either way, they pick a Frenchman, a guy who's the Archbishop, I think in place in France there, and he becomes Clement V. Right. So Clement is the one who, when we talked about the Templars in that article, he was the one who Philip pushed to disbar them, basically disband them on a Friday the 13th. That's why Friday the 13th is an unlucky day. All right. 1309, Clement claims because of his ties to the King of France that he is a target of political violence and that his life is threatened, that he needs to leave Rome entirely. All right. So here's Clement. Apparently, he had an issue with male pattern baldness. What ends up happening is with Philip's help, Clement moves the papacy away from Rome and completely out of Italy to France. All right, to a city in southern France called Avignon, which was one of the cities that's on that bar graph there. All right. So for about 70 years, we got popes that are the line of popes are in Avignon, France. Those, obviously, the French are big supporters of this. Those who are not, find in England primarily. There's some states within the Holy Roman Empire, obviously in northern Italy. In southern Italy, there's a kingdom called Naples that tends to align with France. So those who are opposed to this kind of like 70-year period refer to this as the Babylonian captivity. That's taken from the Old Testament when the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea were basically defeated by the Chaldeans and sent to Babylon. Remember, we talked about in chapter 2, that's where the Bible becomes a book and stuff like that. All right. So this is basically the papal palace still there today in Avignon. All right. Where popes about for not nearly like 70 years in this period kind of lived. All right. Then in 1378, the Pope at the time, Gregory XI, ends up he's visiting Rome on pilgrimage, and he dies. Then the College of Cardinals decided they're going to choose in Rome, the traditional conclave, they're going to choose a new successor, and this guy's Italian. He's the Archbishop of Bari, city in Italy. He becomes Pope Urban VI. Urban signifies a return to the city of Rome. So Urban then sets up shop, moves technically the papacy back to Rome. All right. So initially, that's like, okay, all right, it's kind of back where it's kind of supposed to be. That's not the case. Not everybody's on this page here. All right. And so what ends up happening is there's a number of French cardinals that decide they're going to pick a new pope. All right. So here's Urban. All right. Those French cardinals decide that they're going to pick a guy by the name of Robert of Geneva, who was the Archbishop of Geneva, which is in Switzerland, but it was mainly French speaking. All right. He becomes Pope Clement VII, and then he sets up shop in Avignon. So what ends up happening, we have now two popes simultaneously, one in France and one in Italy. Each of them excommunicate the other. Each of them issues interdicts on these various realms that do not recognize the legitimacy, which is a big deal because you got some confusion here. All right. So people are really worried about their eternal souls, so they're not totally sure who's right. All right. And so this is and there's Robert Geneva. And Clement VII is often, there's two Clement VIIs. This line of popes from here on out that are in France are often referred to as anti-popes. All right, that's something that's kind of put into the historical documentation. So this officially begins the Great Schism, 1378, when we have two popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome. All right. So it's about a period that lasts quite close, was it 40, nearly 50 years or whatever. All right. So you have basically kind of like who supports what pope falls along certain political kind of alliances here. So obviously the English, we have various kind of Germans within the Holy Roman Empire. Italians in the northern part are not big supporters. And then each of them have their own officials in cardinals and all this other stuff. And it gets very, very confusing. All right, so the kind of political map is as such. Those in pink are the ones who support the French papacy in Avignon. That includes parts of what is Castile and Spain and Aragon, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Naples in southern Italy, Scotland, all right, which had gone through an independence kind of battle there. All right, and then the ones in blue or purplish, those are the ones who support the Roman one. Right? And the Holy Roman Empire has, based on the kind of various states there, kind of a mixed alliance, if you will. Now, while this is going on, we find there's a number of people who are very critical of the church because the church is in kind of a confusing period. And you find people that would not normally publicly speak out against the church become a little bit more vocal. One guy's in England, and that's John Wycliffe. All right, you guys know there's a band called the Fugees. All right, Wycliffe Jean, that's where he gets his name from. His father was a preacher named him after John Wycliffe. So Wycliffe is a theology professor, I believe, at Cambridge in England, and he is very critical of the church. Right? He basically has like three kind of beefs. One, he says that it doesn't matter where the papacy is, who the pope is. It doesn't matter. The Pope's not the true head of the church, it's Jesus. Right? Also, this was something that kind of like he was very critical of simony and lay investiture, which was supposed to be handled in the 11th century, but those things tended to happen, simony in particular, right? And so the clergy should not own land or wealth, right? They should not be part of that feudal system. It basically creates a kind of conflict of interest, and that the Bible is the final authority for Christian life, not the Pope, all right? Not any church official. A lot of what Wycliffe is saying is going to be repeated when we talk about Martin Luther. All right, there's a lot of ideas that Martin Luther has that basically you can trace back to Wycliffe. All right, so Wycliffe has got a little bit of leeway here. He's in England. He's a little bit far away from both the Avignon and Rome. All right, but he is labeled. What he is saying is heresy, and to be a heretic was not something to be scoffed at. That was punishable by death, by usually being burned at the stake. All right, so there's an image of Wycliffe probably kind of preaching. He also preached in the vernacular of the day. He didn't read from Latin necessarily. He translated a lot of things from Latin. So he went where the people were. All right. Another critic is in essentially Prague in Bohemia, and that's John Huss, or sometimes referred to as Jan Hus. He is also a professor in Prague. A lot of the same ideas. The big thing Huss talks that basically the Bible is higher than any authority of the Pope. All right. Huss develops quite a bit of following. The followers of Huss are referred to as Hussites. All right, and this is before the Protestant Reformation, a couple hundred years before or at least 100 years before the Protestant Reformation. And so he's going to be kind of influential in that. All right, and so this is Huss right here. This is a later painting, painted during the Reformation, but they show in more Reformation type of garb, if you will. All right. So, roughly at the same time, 1414 here, we have a new Holy Roman Emperor elected. At times, Holy Roman Emperors would be elected if there was not a clear-cut passage of power from Father to Son. All right. His main goal was he wanted to end the Great Schism. That's what he wanted to be known for. So, one of the things also is he encouraged Huss to come to this ecumenical council that he was calling for in Germany, and he would be given safe passage and be able to kind of express himself. That was rescinded. When he got there, he was arrested for heresy, tried, and burned at the stake. All right. Later, though, when we talk about Martin Luther is going to have a similar meeting with the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope at the time in Germany at a place I believe that's also in Worms, and he is going to make sure he gets that. Basically, he makes sure that is not rescinded. All right. So he's going to learn from Huss's mistakes. Also, what ends up happening, this is him being burned at the stake, is that once word gets to the Czech Republic that Huss and a few of his followers were burned at the stake, there was a number of Hussites that went to the castle of Prague, and threw a number of church officials out of the window. They refer to it as the first defenestration of Prague. All right. When you ever throw somebody out of a window, that's called defenestration. So then you can add that to your vocabulary if you ever get into a fight and you basically want to confuse your opponent, but also threaten them. You can say, I'll defenestrate you. That's Mr. Newbert's favorite word. Is that Mr. Newber's favorite word? Now, the second defenestration of Prague occurs in the 1600s. That officially starts the 30 Years' War, which put Europe into a major kind of war of religion here. All right. But at this meeting, this kind of ecumenical council, this is often referred to as the Council of Constance, from where it was held. Ultimately, this ends the Great Schism. By this time, there was actually 3 popes. There was a pope in Avignon, there was a pope in Rome, and then there was a pope in Pisa. They had 2 popes from Pisa. The second of those popes, who at the time of the Council of Constance, was John the 23rd. He was significant because he was basically financially backed by the Medici. And after this, the Medici were able to become the Pope's banker. So what ends up happening is the Pope who was in Avignon, Gregory XI, agreed to step down. All right, they elect Pope Martin V. He unifies the church and returns it back to Rome. All right. Now, when Gregory XI, or Gregory XII, steps down, that was the last time until 2000. I think was it 13 or 14 when Pope Benedict XVI resigned and Pope Francis became Pope. So for about 700 years, the only way popes were leaving that office is if they were dead. All right. And so this is the kind of the declaration, habeas papam, that we have a new pope in Constance.
Today, after school, from 1 to 2, and tomorrow,